Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. Today we are looking at TAL's J8 synthesizer. Now, if you hadn't already noticed, this is clearly a clone of Roland's Jupiter 8. We've been on a bit of a Roland jag recently, and that has actually been very interesting for me as somebody who grew up with Roland sounds all over the radio, but never quite made my peace with the Roland thing. Love the sounds, always struggled with the devices, but I've got a far better understanding now of who and what Roland were, what they were about, what they were doing, and why some of their unusual decisions make sense. We'll go through some more of that. If you're looking for more of that conversation, then have a look at the Roland Cloud video, the Mercury 4, and the TAL's Juno 60, because they're all forming part of this larger conversation about the Roland thing. Jupiter 8 is important because it's largely considered the king of synths, particularly with regards to the analog synthesizer. And there are a lot of things about the Jupiter 8 that have largely defined many things that have gone after and very much within the Roland sphere. King of synths. Now, before someone gets too upset, yes, this does rather make Yamaha's CS80 the emperor of synths, but seeing only 4 people could afford it, it never had the market penetration or appeared on as many records as the Jupiter 8 did. The Jupiter 8 was suddenly all over radio. Kim Wilde's Cambodia, Simple Minds, Promised You a Miracle, Toto's Africa, Roxy Music's Avalon, Real Life, Send Me an Angel, ABBA, Journey, Duran Duran, Marvin Gaye, Michael Jackson, OMD, Tears for Fears, Ultravox, Europe, you name it. Chances are the Jupiter 8 was on that record, if not all over that record. It almost seemed to be that you couldn't get on radio if you didn't have Jupiter 8 sound on your record. Doesn't mean that other things weren't happening, weren't being used. They definitely were, but something about the Jupiter 8 just clicked in and it became the thing. I remember watching Countdown through the early 80s, and just about every band that came on had a synthesizer up the back, and most of them were Jupiter 8s. Whether that's what went on the record, dunno, but the Jupiter 8 was the poster child of synthesizers, soon followed by the DX7. It was like if you didn't have a DX7, you weren't a band, just as if you didn't have a Jupiter 8, you weren't a band. The synthesizer was that important. So it's well worth, if you're not familiar with what a real Jupiter 8 sounds like in the real world, in its real time space, then go out and get some of these records and have a listen to them. And after a while, you'll find the common thread. It shouldn't take too long. And that is why the Jupiter 8 is important. We'll look more at why it's important as well. TAL, we've gone through quite a lot of his stuff. The more time I spend with his stuff, the more I realize that he really does very, very nice work. And he does unique work. He works as a developer who's saying, here's what I'm making. And that's good. I get very tired of generic things, and this is not generic, but it's very high quality. He says that this was calibrated and set up and designed after their own Jupiter 8. Shows a picture of it, so it appears that he has a Jupiter 8, and this is a pretty, I think, reasonable copy of his. I'm never going to get into, is this the same as the original? Who knows, who cares? Half the time the sound of those instruments in the period in which they were active was driven by how they were used. So a Jupiter 8 into a Roland Space Echo is going to sound quite different from a Jupiter 8 into even a VST clone of a Space Echo. So to say they sound the same or they sound different is often because of how they're being used. Even the very different construction of an EDM style track, a modern style of writing compared to the very tuneful style of writing in the early 80s is going to give you a very different feel from the instrument. But it feels very kind of authentic to that Jupiter feel. So full marks for that. We might as well kind of crash into the good and bad. And then as we go through a little show and tell and walkthrough of the device, then you can decide whether you think that A, I've kind of got it about right, and B, more importantly, is this the right synth for you and what you're looking for? So, good. Well, it's rather Rolandy. Again, not getting into whether it's a perfect clone, there's no such thing, but it does very much feel like Jupiter 8. When you find the right points for that classic sound, it's all over it. The sound is quite versatile. You will hear just with some of the show and tell that we can make the synth sound quite different. So one of the concerns I often have with coming into a clone is that, oh, it's going to be a one-trick pony, it'll sound like one thing, it'll give me ba 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 ba, and then I won't be able to do anything else with it. And one of the great things, and probably one of the success stories, reasons for the success story of the Jupiter 8, is that it's really quite versatile. So the versatile sound is still there. Pricing, which we'll get into here, is very good compared to, it's not TAL's cheapest synth, but compared to competitors, like direct competitors, really good pricing for an instrument that personally I feel rises out of just being generic, because there are some clones out there that I feel like they could be any synth, but just because they've got a little bit of Rolandism attached to them or whatever ism of their clone, then people can pretend they're getting that thing. I think we've got a good one here. Well, I have to write bads, and like the last few of these, it's stretching. It is a little complex. TAL has rolled the single all-in-one line strip of the programming style into 2 layers. That, I think, makes it a little bit more complex, but as I've always said about the Roland thing, for some reason I find programming their synthesizers a little unintuitive. So a lot of that's not TAL's fault. I would have probably felt that way regardless. But you do over time get your head around it. But I do often find myself going, oh, where's that thing? Things seem a little bit splashed all over the place. There's a logic to it, but it's not the logic that feels comfortable to me. It does have a limited architecture. We'll have a little discussion on that with some of the show and tell, but nonetheless, once you get your head around how the architecture works, there's a huge amount that you can do, and rather tongue-in-cheek, where were you in 1988? I would have been all over this when it was like my life for a Jupiter 8. Interestingly, through my life, I have never come more than a few meters away from a Jupiter 8. I've never been able to touch one. I have seen bands like Real Life with their Jupiter 8 just a couple of meters away from me, with me under the stage going, but I've never got to touch one. Let's get into that show and tell. First little bit may seem like a distraction, but after doing the Roland Cloud video and understanding a lot more about how that Roland sound is created, I thought to myself, okay, how do I go back and get in control of that for myself? So I made this wee thing. Now, not trying to show off anything in particular other than getting my head around how the Roland sound works. And it becomes very interesting because I had this lying around and I was thinking, oh, maybe I'll make a video just for my own channel about getting the Roland sound without having to have any Roland gear. And I used the Subtractor because it does have a Rolandy Juno-y sort of a sound, despite actually having its designer being actually Nord lead. And the idea of creating these 2 separate synthesizers and pairing them up, but having them a little different from each other with a little bit of detuning in each. Now, I got a great sound, which, again, interestingly enough, somehow seemed to seem a little bit more CS80, but that's probably just a lot of time listening to the Big V. So then when this came up, it's like, okay, how is this Jupiter 8 going to compare to what I had already done? So now, not exactly the same, but most of the characters there, and if it was if the original was on the vinyl and we were at the concert listening to Manfred Mann or whoever playing that, probably a lot more expertly than me, then I think we would not say, oh, that sounds wrong. We'd accept it as being close enough to the original sound. For fairness' sake, and for everything here, it goes through a device which is a pair of echoes and then 3 more echoes ganged together, driven by the initial setting. So it's a pair of delays going into a very simple kind of a reverb. I could have done this with TAL's Dub X, but I already have this, and as a one box, it gives me a little bit of delay, a little bit of reverb. Everything will have that on it. Plus, the reason to show that is that the reverb space on both of these is consistent to help them seem a little bit more fair in how we choose them. The interesting thing that I found in this instance, and this is part of what I mean about limited architecture, is that Subtractor has 3 envelopes. So we've got our amp envelope, our filter envelope, and then we've got a spare modulation envelope. As soon as you put that 3rd envelope into play, you suddenly expand your options. Within the Jupiter, there are 2, and so where I've got the pitch movement in this brass sound, which is the reason it sounds so interesting on the beginning, I only had the 1 envelope to handle both the filter movement and the pitch movement, rather than having 1 for pitch movement, 1 for envelope movement, which is part of why they don't sound quite the same. Without that, they would have been incredibly similar. But if we hear this on its own, we could use it to play that song, and most people wouldn't notice the difference. So it's a really nice synth, which if you had one synth, you could say, make it this J8, and duplicate almost anything that you could find that was done with a synth. And that's a lot of credibility. So brass absolutely excels at. Again, if you went over those records that I pointed out, you would find Jupiter brass everywhere. Bass. That's very classic Jupiter Juno kind of bass, elements of the Ricky Wilde thing, that's Kim Wilde, Kids in America kind of thing. This is using, because the modes are relatively important or can be a big factor in the sound. It's not just the oscillator and filter, the modes and how you put them together can have a big impact on the sound, which we'll go over a bit more later. This is using the arpeggiator. That's more of your Ricky Wilde thing. A little bit more high energy. And it's using the unison. The unison on the real Jupiter 8, to be honest, I forgot to read, or maybe it didn't even explain how it did it here. I don't remember. I don't remember the manual. Maybe I didn't even read it. It wasn't that necessary after the 60. The unison actually took all 8 voices, which is 2 oscillators per voice, no sub, and put all those voices into one key. So that's all our voices. If you played two notes, it didn't force you into monophonic mode. It then just split them out. Now here we're only hearing one voice because it's arpeggiated. You hear how beautifully that sound works with its arpeggiation. But the unison would, one note, give you all 16. Two notes would split them. Three notes, it would split them. So your sound got thinner, but your sound didn't seem to get that much thinner simply because you were playing more notes, which is a richer sound anyway. So it was an interesting approach to unison, quite different from the modern approach of that you just multiply everything by 48 and then... If you are obsessed with that kind of approach, there is the unison detune and spread thing, which I deliberately left out here because to some extent we're saying, hey, let's do the Jupiter 8 thing, and that detune and spread thing is not a function of the Jupiter 8, and therefore it no longer will sound like a Jupiter 8. Might sound like a JD 800, but that's not a Jupiter 8. Next, this is a big attraction for the Jupiter 8. We've got two complete separate synthesizers in here. It's still 8 voice, but we split ourselves into, and this is with the real Jupiter, 4 on the bottom half of the keyboard, 4 on the top half. You can't move the keyboard split. It splits at C3. So C3 goes to the upper. And you've got completely different settings. Arpeggiator running at different speeds. So if we look at our rate here, 1/16, and our rate here, half. Two completely separate synthesizers that we can split to upper and lower half of the keyboard. Now, for those of you who've been following the Roland rant, it alliterates, then you'll see how I've talked about and tried to understand how they were called partials, and then you've got, from the D50, this upper and lower. So the partials are two partials, the 4 of them that are there, are paired off into upper partials and lower partials. Never made sense when I had my friend's D50 in my studio. I was always like, why is it upper and lower? You know, yeah, I get that they're kind of layered, but it comes from this, simply because they had to name the buttons something to say, well, which sound's going up here, the upper half of the keyboard, and which is going lower. So now in the 5080, which was the last of the 1080 series, and even Xenology, they're still referring to their sections in this same format, which is quite literally upper half, lower half of the keyboard. Kind of interesting. So you can have completely separate sounds behaving completely differently. And here's another iteration of it, and part of the whole, this synth can sound very different. So the sounds that you've got so far from this little show and tell have been very sort of early, mid-80s sort of sounds. Rather prog rocky kind of split. One of them's got the arpeggiator on, the other one is not, and overall that sound is not what's become that kind of cliched early 80s type sound. It sounds more 70s. The synth has the ability to move and change, and I hear a lot of people doing very modern stuff with it, and you're not going to say, oh, that's Jupiter 8. So it's a versatile sound, again with the keyboard split, and that you can do different things. You can, of course, also put it into a whole mode. Should we go with the upper? So if we have poly, we can have our full 8 voices. Doesn't really flatter that sound. Or of course into unison. Thank you. As soon as we spread it out, I guess I just have an issue with that sound because you hear it everywhere and it's not very interesting. People will be offended by my saying that, but it just isn't that interesting because largely that's the only thing that they've got the sound doing. It's like, oh yes, let's detune it, spread it out, and pretend that's interesting. It's like, do something with the sound. Ba, 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 ba. Do something, and then it becomes interesting. And so it's playing both of our sounds. And the hold function, if we go back into our keyboard split, not a thing that we're likely to use so much in our DAWs, but if we're doing the performance thing, then the hold can be useful. See, you've got the splits and what have you. So good versatility. Arpeggiator is essentially the same as what's in the Juno 60, so we won't spend a lot of time looking at that. The assign modes is just different kinds of voice stealing. The nicest is Poly 2. Read the manual, understand how that works. But that's what all of this is about. Very, very nicely, we're given an ability to copy and paste. So where we've got a sound that we've made on one of our upper or lower partials, if we want to clone it to the other, in the old days you would have to flip across, and which is great because that's how you end up with your discrepancies. But it can also be a bit annoying, a bit of a buzzkill. So we can simply say, let's copy and paste. We can also load different patches into each of these. So nicely thought through. It's a simple method that keeps us on the panel and solves the problem we're likely to feel like we've got. Nicely done. Arpeggiator, as you see, it's got its rate here. It defaults to internal, which I think is great because while working in a DAW, we will want to be synchronized to our tempo. The arpeggiator is capable of being used for so much more than just boom, boom, boom kinds of things. It's brilliant for doing those don't need a gun kind of thing, but it can be used for a lot more than that. So it's kind of nice that it defaults you to something else. If, however, we do not like the default patch, then we can actually go through and save our own. That was the same on the Uno 60, and it's a really nice thing. Really, really nice. It is a little more annoying than you start a synthesizer, and every time the default patch just does not suit your workflow. This allows you to say, this is my workflow, and it's there in the default patch. You don't have to go find it somewhere. Yes, there are patches. Some of these are clones of actual tracks. Lucky Man was not really a Jupiter 8 thing. It was a modular, nor do I think it's the best clone, but most of the others are really rather cool. The others, honestly, I've not been through, didn't even look at the factory ones on these. I don't see it as a preset machine. Balance allows us to choose the level difference between our upper and lower. You saw me use this before. So you can balance and mix them. You can also set tuning and panning differently for each of your upper and lower. Nice. In terms of a mix, there are times that you want to use them. Master tune affects the whole device. If you want to affect just one of the layers, then use your internal one. Octave, again, affects the whole set. Portamento is able to be assigned to different parts of the thing. If you're unsure, take your time, read the book. Time changes the time scaling we talked about in the last one. We have both a pitch and a mod wheel. This is not accurate. Whether this is a good or bad thing, I don't know. Part of me sort of straight away missed the mod button, because if you look at a real Jupiter 8, it has a button, which is the same as what we saw in the 60, that there's a button that you're playing along, and rather than raising the mod wheel to get wobbly, you press the button and it just goes wow, 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 wow from there. Actually quite a cool thing. So I guess in the negatives I could say, give me back the button. The mod button is a unique feature of this instrument. However, if you're really going to get a bit thoughtful about it, there's absolutely no reason that within your DAW you can't simply assign your mod wheel to a particular place, whether that's 100 or whatever. Then within your DAW you can program it to be on, off, without the wheel in between of the wheelie thing. So it's not the end of the world. It would just be kind of cool to have the button, because the button's going to behave differently from the wheel. We can assign, again in odd amounts, how our mod wheel works. A pitch wheel we can also assign to the VCO. And assign that to one of the oscillators. Mod wheel can be assigned to LFO and or VCF. A little on the unique side, but focus on the character of the instrument, and chances are you will find that you come up with a very cool result. A lot of this is very similar to the and even that Mercury 4, because it's the Roland way, and as we've established, the Roland way is, let's not change anything ever. Let's try to improve the technology behind it, but let's not change anything. They're incredible traditionalists, which can be a liability or a strength. If you're really chasing the Roland sound, it is a strength. We'll hide the keys. We don't really need them. The Jupiter 8 also started to show us an ability to have a much more refined sound. And if asked randomly where that was from, what synthesizer was from, a lot of people might start at DX7, something digital. But it was possible to start to get sounds from it. They didn't happen automatically everywhere, but it was possible. This one is made up of this sound, which gets its brightness from the cross modulation, which we'll come into later. And very nice little, well, Jupiter 80 kind of string. Put the two together. Oops, back together, dual. You get this interesting sound that was hard to do before this. Let's go back to my default. Actually, it's not my default, that's their default, but good enough. Copy, paste. This is where I get confused. It's sometimes a little hard to know which layer you're on. Visual referencing is not great, but this is the nature of the instrument. The more TAL starts to alter that, the less like a Jupiter 8 it becomes. So, annoyance, but it's also a necessary annoyance. LFO has to be assigned to something or it doesn't do anything. Very high rate, go up to 40 Hertz, which is really getting up into the beginnings of FM territory. You can synchronize it, but as we all know, I never do that. I virtually never do that. A delay, like the Uno 60, has this nice ramp in. Different waveforms. And the Roland, the random LFO. Yeah. We've got envelope modulation of our VCO, so that's pitch. Which is what you heard at the beginning of that brass sound. And if you want to make a good brass sound, you've got to have one of the oscillators do that. So if you put this into dual mode, actually let's just copy that one and paste it there and then get rid of that. That's really important. It's a big part of it, the envelope mod. Let's go back to whole. You can choose whether that's going to apply to one oscillator or both, or you can have it apply to the cross modulation. So while this style of synth architecture does limit a lot of the cool Doctor Who sound effects that you could do with a modular, the cross modulation opens that door further than had been the case with your more typical just the facts ma'am, the Juno style of thing. Cross modulation is kind of cool. It is, as far as I am aware, FM, but it's coarse FM. So it's not the same as Yamaha's DX7. So while you do it expecting DX7, and occasionally you can get DX70 type results, you will get coarse, rough, ugly, ghastly sounds from it. But sometimes you'll get something just right. We can assign, that's what we just went over. We can pulse width modulation. And as I talked about last time, Roland's pulse width modulation is very nice. It's a massive feature. It does honestly feel a bit different in this than it does from the Juno. So whether there is a real difference or whether it's just a difference that feels like it's there as a result of the architecture, I'm not sure. But it doesn't feel like it behaves the same. I think the logic's the same, but there's something that feels different. So we've got a few ways that we can handle our pulse width modulation there, which is pretty cool. You can, of course, invert your envelope as well. Cross modulation. Quite literally seems to be taking oscillator 2's frequency, what's coming out of it, the results of oscillator 1, and using that waveform to modify the frequency of oscillator 1, and yes, that's real FM. It does mean that you can get nice belly sounds from it. Not for every situation, but there are times where it works really nicely. It would be nice sometimes for there to be a little finer control on some of these things, but again, that's a Roland thing. It doesn't seem like shift really has much play in this. Control, actually, no, sorry, control does. I thought control seemed to stop them, but no, my bad. You do have the ability to control those very finely, but it's not using the standard VST shift. It's using control, and then it becomes very, very fine, which is, well, very, very fine. So it can play solved. Let's go back to... And let's back that down. Oscillators. Without the cross modulation, you've got... Doesn't go down to 32, but if you need 32, then you'd be using this. Waveforms are triangle, not sine. Sine's over there. Saw. A pulse or a solid square. Kind of limited, but there's a lot you can do. You can sync the oscillators together, so you can sync VCO 1 to 2 or 2 to 1. So depending upon which way you want to go, you can choose one or the other. Most times in a synthesizer, it's you sync 2 to 1, which means that you turn off 1 and you listen to 2. But this you can sort of pick and choose. So sometimes you get a result one way, sometimes you get a result the other way. What that's doing is resetting the duty cycle of that waveform, therefore giving a different waveform, and it takes on the tuning of its dome. So if we have get it right, you end up with a really cool gnarly sound. It's quite common on leads in early to mid 80s, like the Cars used it a lot. Your second oscillator is different from the first oscillator. First obvious thing is that you can pop it into an LFO mode, which we may not be able to hear here, but it can turn itself into an LFO. Otherwise, we've got different tunings, and tuning is by semitone. Interesting way that it's displayed here, this being 0, and then that being 2 octaves down to get to 8. But it is what it is. And then we've got standard fine tune. So most times if we want to run these together, we'll get into the PWM 2. Really nice, rich sound straight out the gate with very little going on. And that's one of the real strengths of a lot of these old synths, is that they just move so nicely without getting into doing a lot of stuff, which is why in the early days, when you watch bands on stage, they actually didn't have fancy synths. They just had a fairly simple synth architecture that just gave you such a nice sound that you accepted it for what it was the whole way through, even though it was the one synth that was probably playing the whole way through, maybe with a different patch change, but essentially it was the same thing. Nice raw sound. The nicer your oscillator raw sound is, the less pressure there is on the filter, and the more likely you are to get a lovely result, or an interesting result at least. So nice rich sound. We've got that low high-pass filter, which is pretty important for clarifying a sound. See how that clarifies really nicely? We get a really nice string sound. And that would sit wonderfully in a mix. Especially if we were to turn on or both of those. And then, of course, yes, I hear you all. We could... I can't remember how the rest of it goes. But it's easy to actually overdo it with the amount of depth that you can put into this. That sounds really nice as a sort of a Selena strings kind of a thing, which is great. Then the low pass filter. We've got a choice between 12 and 24 dB. Don't always assume that 24 dB is going to sound better than 12. Yes, if you're making a bass sound, possibly. 12 dB filter if it's nicely built, and this is a nicely built 12 dB filter, as is the classic SEM filter, the state variable filter, the SVF. You get a really nice sound out of those, particularly for strings. Let's go with a little bit of envelope mod for those extra little bits just provide so much more richness to the sound. A few too many keys there. We've got a huge variety of tones, and the Jupiter 8 as used at the time was just about those tones and the little bit of movement that you could put in around them. So 12-tone bore, resonance, and envelope. Now it's tied to, by default, envelope 1, envelope 2 being your amplifier envelope. It's not very well noted, but that is the way it goes. Even though on a lot of synths it's the other way around, but this is the last one in line, therefore envelope 2, but you can flip across to using envelope 1. Very synthy. So try the different variations, you'll be surprised what you get. LFO mod. You can hear there with the LFO. First one, we'll exaggerate this a little bit. First one takes a while to come in. Second note, LFO is already there. So that is different behavior from what you would expect with a modern digital synth. Which has a charm of its own. It really does. Key follow. So that's balancing out. Filter works over the keyboard. So I really want to do the bass. And you don't want the higher notes to have as much impact. So boom, 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 boom. You want the boom, the higher one to not seem as bright. Changes how we're going. And that can have a pronounced impact on the feel of that bass line on your record. So don't be afraid to play with key follow to get the right kind of evenness across your musical line. Velocity sensitivity. So that's your envelope modulation. Again, very much going to have an impact on how your performance goes. So if you wanted to do a kind of bass line where you're playing the filter resonance as the pitching, so to speak, then your velocity sensitivity is the way, but you will probably need to leave that fully up. VCA sets your overall synth level, but you've also got volume here. Now this will drive. You're hearing it start to drive. Some of that may be a little bit of compression afterwards because I'm making sure we don't explode things on your end either, but you can push things pretty hard here. It doesn't seem necessarily like it's going to get as raucous as the Uno 60, but it will get a little grindy here, which is nice. We can set our velocity sensitivity for volume. Kind of seems like not a big deal these days, but it was a fairly big deal at the time. There are a lot of tones in here that I'm recognizing from a lot of records, and obscure things too, like that sounds suspiciously like Neon Judgment. And of course we can assign our modulation to our amplifier as well. Now you see, as in different from some modern synths where you process all your modulation either on a mod matrix, which is my preferred way of doing it, or that you assign it at the LFO. You say, okay, whilst we're thinking LFO, then we send some to here and some to there in the one spot. You've got to go to the filter. And while there's a fair sense to that, it can be quite confusing to work out, well, what am I looking at? What's doing what? It's got all these arrows. There's something about it that I just find unintuitive. And that's how we get these really nice, rich, big sounds. One oscillator. Another oscillator, pair it together. There's not a thing. Got your chorus. I'm sure these are supposed to be the same as the ones in the Uno. Maybe they are slightly different. In Jupiter, they feel like they're different, but again, that may be a result of with the Uno 60 being such a single oscillator kind of a situation. This is already a dual oscillator situation and can be up to 4 oscillators if we're running in dual mode. So if we go back to let's get a Blade Runner on ourselves. drop the pair of them together. And we take that in as one sound, but we've actually got two discrete synths in here. Remember, we've got the pair together. And bring them together with the chorus. There is a delay built in, which is not authentic. It works nicely. And we can see how this sound ended up on everything. It has, as its thing, its mode of operation is very defined by what you see on screen. If you come into it thinking, well, that's going to do the same as Serum, only better because it's analogy, then you'll get frustrated. The real joy in it is kind of giving yourself over to what the instrument is going to lead you into doing, which is going to be, at least if you're remotely like me, that kind of thing. We also have, which we looked at last time, the very nice service control thing, which means that we can move the tuning and attack, decay, release, and even into panning if we want, but it's not there by default, of each voice. So not just each oscillator, but each voice. So each oscillator within each voice is modified as well. We get a lot of regions from that. As you hear, if we get really intense, we can get a huge amount of variety in some of those voices. This seriously needs to go for a service, because right now we've got filters far too far. That's very much the nature of these instruments, that if you put 3 or 4 of them in the room, each one will feel different from the others because its voices are all higgledy-piggledy. And so it's well worth, if you're running several instances of this inside a piece, let's say you've got 4 or 5 of your J8s providing you different lines, going into the service control, hitting the random on each one of them, just so that you end up with a little bit more movement, unless you do want to really have that feeling of, here's my one Jupiter that I have played over each of these lines, in which case it's going to be quite consistent, and then it becomes your sound, the sound of your Jupiter, as it sits today, because next week they're probably all like this again. They were a reasonably stable instrument, but they are not stable by modern digital standards, especially the early ones. The very early ones, the clock speed just wasn't quite enough to keep up. The later ones were more reliable in that, but nonetheless, analog gear tends to be all kind of like here, there, and everywhere. Change of weather, synth is off. I think that really kind of covers everything. It's an instrument that you're going to connect with and love, or not connect with and just not get, and maybe even hate. Not because there's anything wrong with it, simply because it is what it is, and it will never be anything other than what it is, which is either going to turn you off, or you're going to get your head around it and go, there is nothing that does this for me. Again, not getting into whether it's a perfect clone or not, because I don't think there's any such thing, even when we put 3 or 4 Jupiter 8s into a room. But does it deliver a Jupiter 8-ness? Hell yes. Does it do it well priced? Yes, most definitely. Is it going to work for you in your music? That's up to you. Go grab the demo, download it, pop it in situ, and then spend some time getting comfortable with what it is. You may find that you take to it like a duck to water, or you may be like me and find that it's a little But once you start to realize what it delivers you, which is hard to get out of other things, then you'll either go, yeah, look, this really isn't the thing that I'm looking for, or you'll go, this is what I've been looking for all my life. Any questions? Ask them down below, preferably after hitting the subscribify button. Pop over to higherhertz.com as well, and you can do the same thing there. Keep it on the bright side. You have a great day now.